Welcome to the stream. Today I'm doing another volunteer storm with one of the Instagram giveaway winners. His name's Jeremiah. I'm gonna ask him to say, "Hey, what's up?" in the chat so you guys can identify him. I've got about 20 hands marked, and the way this one turned out, it developed into a theme that I'm gonna call volatility. I'm not sure how much I've talked about volatility profiles on the stream so far. It's been one of the themes that I've been developing more and more with the CFP program. With intentions of clarifying their decision trees versus specific player profiles, primarily fish, because I think it's one of the main ways that you get your bluff catching efficiency up is to be able to come up with really organized decision trees around how to approach fish who are aggressing into you. So this volatility thing is a metric that we basically developed for how to bluff catch versus fish. And there's a really simplified explanation for it. You just end up calling a lot. The more advanced explanations I'm going to save for a run at once exclusive video that I'm going to do where I'll break it down in a more step-by-step detailed format. Go ahead and someone say something in the chat so that I know that we're live. Okay, cool. I see you guys. So I'm going to let this theme sort of develop organically, as usual, I guess. And Jeremiah, feel free to shout out thought processes or comments that could help deepen the analysis along the way. By the way, if any of you guys were partaking in the thought experiment that I posed in the blog, I just posted my best shot at a succinct answer for what I was talking about there. At first I said, can anybody answer this in one sentence or less? The question was, why is it that in a multi-street betting game, the bettor has to balance more bluffs on previous streets? The answer to the question that I was mainly looking for, which I think is widely misunderstood, is that the bluff catching player needs to get to showdown at some sort of required rate over multiple streets, where on the river he just needs to be good enough when he calls versus the range that the villain is betting. So over multiple streets there's this additional obligation of the bluff catcher, not just to be able to call future streets at the incentive point or to be able to be bluff catching at indifference or better on future streets, but also to get to free showdown frequently enough that the pot odds laid on the previous street are sort of honored, I guess you could say. Think about it this way. If you called a bet on the flop thinking that you had 33% equity versus a pot size bet, that doesn't matter if the villain is following through at 100% frequency on the next street at balance for pot because he wins the effective pot on that following street, meaning you lose all the money you put into the pot up to that point. It's a pretty blatant indicator that there's something going on over multiple streets that's requiring an additional obligation of the bluff catcher to get to free showdown more frequently than if it were just a single street game. Yet a lot of guys are giving answers like, well, you can leverage it with future streets of betting, or actually one of the good ones was bluffs have equity on earlier streets, which allows us to bluff more, but that doesn't exactly get to the bottom of the theoretical toy game reason why you have to bluff more, even if your bluffs were to have zero equity. This is one of the things, and I mentioned this in the blog when I posted it, that I really believe that 98% of the elite community still doesn't fully understand this concept. I think there's guys that grasp it more intuitively, but unless you really deconstruct it and become fluent in what's going on in multi-street betting games, I think you're severely hindered in your ability to go in and do advanced modeling, and even more relevantly than that, to go in and do advanced decision tree organization, constructing organized decision trees in ways that interact relevantly with specific lines and specific range reads. In other words, once you start profiling players and assigning them confidence intervals for their ranges in certain spots, if you're unclear on this concept of how multi-street betting incentive works, you're going to be distorting your, I guess you could say you're distorting your incentives of what type of conditions you need to justify calls in certain spots. So you really have to have this fleshed out. And it's interesting, I was telling the guys last night, I think I was talking to Tim about it, and I said, I really didn't see a video ever made on this past the point of a Matthew Janda Cardrunners video like back in 2010, where he literally, it was like in Janda's heyday, where he was just getting popular as sort of like theory pioneer, and he was actually taking the time to the best of his ability to contextualize how this type of stuff worked. One of the videos he made was multi-street betting game concepts, and it was sort of a standard Janda procedure of creating a slideshow and reading word for word the slideshow off on his video, which was just his style. And while he got a lot of flack for that video making style, I thought that those videos were probably the most advanced and sort of full or condensed version of theory that we had at the time. And then eventually that scaled into the book Applications of No Limit Hold'em, which up until that time was probably the best metric that we had for applying theory concepts somewhat practically. So was there a lot of stuff that Janda didn't know? For sure. PO Solver wasn't out yet. We didn't have the type of power that we had behind looking into well-balanced strategies and understanding equilibrium as deeply. But did Janda understand toy game theory? Very much so. And I thought that his attempt to contextualize it in a way for the community was something that was unprecedented at the time. So to me, he'll always be sort of a standout figure in the development of poker theory, because he was the first guy who really cared enough to start to really put it together for the community. I'm sure there was guys that understood it before him, but he was the first one to actually take the time as a coach and try to convey that stuff. And it was the thing that actually drew me towards theory to begin with, as I finally saw how much of the game. I think that video exactly was a critical point in my career, because it basically knocked me on my ass, and I had to admit for the first time I didn't understand how multi-street betting games even worked, and I was drastically underestimating the obligation I had as a bluff catching player on a given street to be able to realize equity with a hand. And it was a huge wake-up call for me. It was one of those moments that you remember in your career where your paradigm gets shattered, and you have the choice of whether or not you want to fight it in terms of claiming that that person's wrong, or go into your shell and cry victim and quit poker, or get back up and try to learn this stuff and integrate it in a way that's going to be useful in the future. And I think the reason that there was no way I could refute this, because I was coming from a very logical, analytical background to begin with, and all the shit that he was saying was smarter than me and made sense when I actually looked at it. So it was very hard to refute. In other words, I basically got owned analytically, and it was a pretty painful moment in my career, but I think it also leveraged me into I think it definitely leveraged me into the growth pattern that I needed to be on, even though even after taking that trajectory shift, I still wasted tons of time with over-analysis. So before I head into this, it leads me to this next topic I want to discuss on a more philosophical level, but definitely mental game driven, which is, what is a mistake? Because imagine, I was talking to the CFP guys the other night, and we were talking about stuff like fear of failure. There's actually a Run It Once video that's going to go out like in 7 days or so, which I did was specifically a phone call with a CFP student on fear of failure. But we were talking more generally about it, and I said, what is it? Let me look at the Skype message. Because I started to just be, it was one of my more philosophical posts in the thread. I wonder if I'm able to find it, because this group is so active. Okay, so here's what I said. Imagine how you would feel if you knew that with 100% certainty, every mistake you made only actually sped your journey up to your overall goal of happiness and success. How would that affect your level of stress and playfulness? How would it relieve you of doubt and self-judgment? Now, how assumptive is it of you to claim that mistakes are actually leading you off course? In other words, what proof do you have that a mistake has ever slowed your journey to refined happiness or deeper understanding? Or isn't it always the way you respond to the mistake that defines it? So it's a really interesting contemplation because what it does to the perception is it forces a macro viewpoint into the mix, where usually we're very contracted in our assessment of a certain scenario or event in a way that either labels it as a mistake, something that induced lack, or a positive, something that induced abundance or immediate happiness. That association is hugely driven by what sort of bias assumptions we're placing on that event or scenario. What I'm saying is, what if we had such a macro perspective? Like, picture you at the end of your life, looking at any of the mistakes that happened when you're 20, 25, 30, basically at any age, any mistake that you thought was devastating, with the perspective of the old man version of you, would that still appear to be as devastating as it was? In other words, would the version of you that had much more perspective on your lifelong journey really give as much credibility to the assessment of a specific event? Or would it see from a larger perspective that it was actually how you responded to that mistake that defined it as crippling or awesome? So the goal here is to get you more aligned with a macro view of your life to see that it actually doesn't matter like nearly as much as you think how much you think you're fucking up in the micro. In fact, what if you were able to make so many mistakes early on that you were to leverage all those mistakes into an accelerated growth pattern that's self-corrected very quickly? Interestingly enough, this is something Janda was really big on back in the day. I remember having several talks to him with him where he was very big about the consideration. He was big on this consideration that it makes a lot of sense for a person to be very aggressive with their life adventures in their 20s. In other words, trying to, like new startups. I think he was mainly referring to it in terms of like business endeavors. But how much room you had to fuck your life up and have it not matter from 20 to 30. And why aren't we taking more risks in that zone of our life? So it's this type of thinking that I think is useful because it really neutralizes the definition you have of a mistake in terms of letting it have power over you. Because as soon as there's a mistake, there's usually the core belief that I can't be confirmed a failure. And then it triggers also the core belief that I'm actually countering a belief in unworthiness. That's why I fear mistakes. So if you can neutralize the definition of mistake, the next thing you realize is that the only thing it was ever really protecting was this core belief of failure, and then you have that to address. Is that really an objective thing to hold myself accountable for, that I need to counter a sense of unworthiness? Or would it be much more healthy for me to realize that that's an assessment in itself, and just to approach life from more of a self-forgiving presence, I guess you could say, where yes, you're aware of seeing that you had an inaccurate decision that you made, but knowing with larger perspective that what mattered was that you self-corrected from that place, and that that's all that mattered in the macro. In other words, what I'm saying is, if all of you had made proper self-corrections at key mistake points in the course of your life, you would be on a way stronger trajectory than you are right now, myself included. There's tons of indicators. If you're not overly insistent in how you need to go about solving problems and forging ahead, there are tons of indicators that you can take from the environmental feedback that could put you on a more relevant, incentivized, holistically incentivized, healthy trajectory. Just most of the time we're blinded to those because we're so insistent on how we need to get something done. Over-analysis is a really good example of this. And the reason that we're insistent is because the implication of admitting that we're doing it the wrong way is more painful for us in the short term micro than actually just admitting, okay, I actually do have a poor perspective here. I should shift it and drop my identity with the process or approach that I have and actually get started in another direction. In a lot of ways, that's the entire reason that most markets stagnate, is because most people are not okay with the fact that they have to sack their approach. So I recommend experimenting as a weekly challenge. Say this week, you try to be as aware of as possible of your tendency to label something a mistake and then judge yourself for it. And as often as possible, try to bring an intensity around reframing that mistake as pure potential in the direction of accelerated growth, and see what happens. Let's get started. This first hand I marked as a conditional river decision. Let's take a look one more time. This is a limper preflop. Small blind ISOs, I would probably just fold this hand pre. A lot of guys overemphasize the amount of profit they're going to be making with certain types of quality equity hands just because there's a fish behind. First of all, your hand quality is shit in terms of the robustness of it for the most part. Secondly, you're out of position versus the fish, which is going to hurt both your realization and your implied potential for extracting value across 3 streets. So, third, I could say that the data point of small blind is probably not ISOing as wide as he should be, because that's an environmental trend not to ISO wide enough versus fish limpers. I'm not all that excited about this. I think I would probably start calling with king jack. So it's not bad, but it's cuspy for sure. Donking out here is whatever. We're getting resistance from the fish. Obviously our hand's strong enough to follow through on the turn even with 2 callers. Fish calls. Now we triple barrel the river, which is fine. Fish raises. So this introduces the first real parameters behind volatility profiles, the metrics behind volatility profiles. Usually, the fact that this guy is limping automatically has me, how do I say this, profiling him in a confidence interval that I don't have respect for, basically. So a volatility profile is basically a profile that has such inconsistencies in its methods that it's very hard to assign him a finite range with any degree of real confidence. The reason that's important here is because at the moment we lose confidence that this guy could either be spaz raising with like ace-7 club at some frequency or just putting it in with a dominated 10, which you see happen, like, and I don't know what the mentality is, but like with only less than a min raise behind, a lot of fish, or enough fish that I would lose confidence in trying to make hero folds against them, enough of them are doing stuff like saying, well, there's not much left behind, I'll just rip it in with these trips or with this top pair. Let's just get it in because it seems like the hand is, I don't know, strong enough. I'm projecting thought process here, but for some reason, they launch it in and repolarize with hands that aren't necessarily strong enough to do it. So with a initial fish profile that this guy's a limper, usually that's enough for me to enter him into a category of volatility that will have me very reluctant to make big river folds or big folds post flop versus him. Now there are some fish where if you have enough reads, if he's the guy that's running like 40 VPIP, 3 PFR, and he has like very non-existent like post flop aggression frequencies, the type of guy that will only bet with like the nuts and will never raise a depolarized spot on the river. Sure, that's the guy you can make a hero fold against, but that type of information is few and far between, and that type of profile is much less common than just the guy with higher VPIP moderate volatility or high VPIP high volatility. So I mark this hand as conditional in the sense that versus a reg, I think this is a clear fold because the reg won't be making these type of volatility mistakes that you have to account for. But versus the fish, I think it's a necessary call. So it's conditional in that way. 3-bet preflop is way too weak here. That's one of the questions in the chat. Mainly because this ISO range is tighter than most people think. Also, relative to flatting, I think 3-bet loses merit because even though I'm saying you don't have great implieds versus the fish, like you still gain some things versus the fish by the fact that he'll do stupid stuff post flop. So if it's a cuspy 3-bet, usually my recommendation is still call on this spot, even though you're out of position versus the fish, because it's still worth something in the cold call line that you're going to gain something back from the fish who misplays post flop. That being said, it's definitely more advantageous with more robust hands. We're getting 3-bet squeezed here. This is a better spot to call. Specifically, my eye is on the target player fish right here. Target because I'm noticing he's a short stack, which automatically puts him in a confidence interval of fish at a higher rate. So there's a lot you can do with observation note taking that I think most guys are autopiloting on, and they would increase their win rate mainly through the zone of call efficiency much more if they put more attention on note taking at the table, or just player profiling in general. Even if the only thing you did was try to get notes on who the fish were, I think it would be super beneficial for overall win rate. Here, I think calling is superior to raising because with the nutted preflop hand, I think that you're more than incentivized to allow the fish to do something stupid behind, like put it in with a wider range that he will compound errors with to the flop. So I feel strongly that this is a better call than 4-bet. You're basically knocking the fish out with a hand that doesn't need the protection. Do this with ace-king if you want, or queens, but not this hand, or even kings. Standard post-flop. Here's a 3-bet. Flop and turn are both fine. Now the river, let's assume we have no volatility read, which means this player is not doing anything dramatically wild. I have to look at this river and assess it as code red, meaning many of his natural bluffs from the turn that were gutters are now paired, and they're not very commonly turned into bluffs, especially on a board where you are relatively uncapped. So now I'm adding perceived range awareness into the mix of the river decision tree. In the CFP group, a lot of what I'm doing at this point is scaling them towards subconscious integration. In other words, many of the data points that are present in when I look at a hand and my subconscious is sort of cycling through and lighting up at me in different ways, it's not actually raw data points that I see. In other words, there's not like this sentence construction going through my mind when I'm analyzing this river. What it's like is more akin to just a toggling or flashes of almost sensory data, and I'm feeling it more as like a pulse, but that pulse has a translation embedded into it that I am intuitively sensing into. So for instance, if there's a code red runout, which is what this is, I don't necessarily see code red runout in terms of text scrolling across my mind. What I feel is some sort of data packet that's being brought to the front from the subconscious that pulses at me in a way that I recognize that the priority data point is code red. This is what I mean about bridging to subconscious integration. It's a very hard thing to try to bring context to because it's very counterintuitive to try to bring context to something that has left context. In the book Art of Learning, which is one that I recommend constantly in my blog, it's one of the only books that I've ever really read and been like, that's truth. And I've been able to work independently just from a lot of the knowledge in that book. There's a section on it called Numbers to Leave Numbers, which in chess, the way that he brought context around it was he would study very, very intense positional dynamics in order to grasp the data points that were relevant from a technical or theoretical aspect, range construction aspect, we could say, to translate, and then eventually he would no longer process those analytically when he went back into session, and he would allow his subconscious to basically light up at him because he trusted that those patterns were integrated. So much of what this process is hardcore work at the table, hardcore work at the study portion of the table, away from session, in a way to repetitively train data point analysis in a way that relates it to textures, relates it to formations and textures in specific spots, so that eventually you can come back in game, not have to actively be producing a structured decision tree, but still have the recall of spots that you've integrated up until then. So it's something that I'm going to be doing a run at once video on and describing in detail, I think, how the process works and what you can expect during integration phases to know that you're on the right track. But it's very abstract in the sense that how do you train something that moves away from conscious analytical thought process and moves into spontaneous recall? And what does that process look like? How do I express that process to someone who's only used to looking at things in A, B, C, D order? that other example I always use with the Grandmaster Expert, where they put them in a certain position. You could say they put them down and look at this river, and while the expert player is processing an organized decision tree, step 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, the Grandmaster just has spontaneous recall and actually understands the spot at a way deeper level. So there's correlations with this and other learning techniques. I in no way made it up, but I do think I'm expanding on it in the direction of this type of format, which is textural analysis combined with data points in a specific field. I think these are ignition hands, yeah. Which means we get to see what he had. So it's a good representation of why the jack matters. Code red in the sense that it completes his Jack X Broadway bluffs. Code red in the sense that it also gives him some nutted hands, some straights. So I think this could have been a check fold. There's a dead limp. We raise to 4x, get flatted by a middle position. Now we're stabbing turn, we get there on the river. Our hand's obviously strong enough to value bet in this line. Now we're facing a raise. And what's likely going on here if we're justifying a call is that we're going into some sort of range analysis. Correct me if I'm wrong, Jeremiah. But in order to rationalize a call on this line, usually there's some sort of tunnel that the mind enters where it tries to justify that there is some sort of reason why his line doesn't make sense, and it'll usually do that by focusing in on a specific portion of his range, rationalizing that it exists at a higher rate, or that it makes up more of his overall distribution than it does combinatorically, and then it will blow that out of proportion and rationalize the call based on that. So in this spot, it could be something along the lines of, well, he doesn't check back a set on this flop, and I have removal on the jack, so he can't have that much two pair by the river. He probably doesn't even play jack nine suited to begin with, and he probably doesn't raise ace jack, so he can't beat me with a more depolarized hand. All of that is trumped by the very fact that this line just is not getting bluffed enough through general psychology. One thing I'm learning, or one thing we're working on if you're in the night vision group, I have decent support for this so far, just based on frequencies that we see the raise occur at. But more than that, what I would love, and what we're working on in the night vision, is to get 100 million hand database sample going from a few different environments where we're able to deconstruct the river bluff frequency in face raise lines in significant pots, like say 40 BB pots plus, so that we have enough showdowns over that sample that we can basically plot what the average bluffing frequency is in those lines. And if we have a major enough deviation, like say they're showing up with only like 20% bluffs in this line, where on average they're using like a 2/3 pop bet or something, that is a really good indicator that there are very, very few anomalies where people are over bluffing. Because once you have a large enough deviation over an aggregation report that they're just not bluffing nearly enough on all textures combined, it becomes very rare to see anomalies where they would be over bluffing. That should be intuitive. So it's really cool to be able to find a huge deviation spot where they're under bluffing on the river and to be able to prove it through massive database sample, because from that point on, you can have an inclusive integration that flies over the top of any analysis that you would try to enforce. Basically what it tells you is there is less assumptive data available in the mass database analysis confirmation than your ability to range analyze. In other words, it knocks you on your ass by showing you that your range analysis is, for the most part, hugely biased if the range analysis is trying to get you to justify calls in a spot where the pool is, on average, under bluffing by 8% in a certain line. So this is what I mean when I say we can move towards, okay, data analysis at its finest, at its most advanced, would be a way to play the game in many different lines without knowing anything except the large deviation hotspots that you could just flood in on without even having to range analyze. Now that works better in pools that are substantially imbalanced because there'll naturally be more of those spots. The problem we run into is basically database size. That's the main one. So the river situations might not occur frequently enough unless we have transparency to all the hole cards, which we do on Bovada, but we don't have huge database sizes on it on Ignition Bovada. So then we look to something like PokerStars, where we can have huge samples where We need showdowns now to get accurate understandings of what the distribution is of the bluffing range or betting range in a line like this. That takes a lot larger of a sample to do. But if you could get that, now you're able to plot a lot of different spots where you could just fold or call based on pattern recognition alone if the deviations are large enough to override that texture matters much at all. In other words, if I told you that the deviation is large enough on this bluff raise that 98% of textures will be under bluffed, well, that's good enough reason for you to just close your eyes and fold to any river raise rather than try to go in and sift through which textures might be the ones that he's bluffing too much on. So that's what I'm into right now. Is I think it could be really valuable to offer a paranoid community proof that they're just not getting bluffed enough on the river and they can stop with all the arrogant range analysis and just go to the very intelligent macro confirmation from 100 million database hand samples that say fold the river first raise. What up, D-Dog? So that's a fold. I think I made that clear enough. Call 3-bet, call flop, call turn. We're folding the river here with a hand that ties the bottom of his correct value range. King Queen would be a standard blast off for him here. I'm also looking at his base rate of bluffs being substantially increased here. There's a flush draw that missed. There's Ace Queen, Ace Jack. There's gutters and open-ended straight draws galore. So in the realm of possible textures where I'm folding substantially high up in my range, which would already need me to be operating under assumption that he was never bluffing too often. Since I'm already tying with a portion of his value range, in theory that should already give me enough reason to call. But okay, say he's under bluffing, now I can counteract those two and maybe still justify a call. But I can't do that with confidence here because this board lends itself to so many natural bluffs that he could just be firing 3 at. So based on the base rate of bluffs being the data point that's flashing in my subconscious, I'm not ready to assign a level of confidence that this is a spot that's just wildly under bluffed. He's got a lot of candidates that he can pull triggers with here, more so than on other textures, I would think. No mistakes, so don't worry about it. I tell the CFP guys this, that something else I said in the chat the other night. I said, in a lot of ways, this program this program cares very little how many mistakes you make, but it has a lot of intention and expectation that you do not repeat mistakes. So basically, I've said before, I have no problem offering up my time for free, basically. Even though this is a contracted program that eventually has payouts. But in terms of like how I approach it on the day-to-day, like I'm volunteering more or less. That's how I see it. And I like it like that because it keeps me humble and energized from a good energy. That being said, if I feel as though there's an expectation from the student to have me look over hands and baby him in spots where I've already pointed out this is the leak, go integrate it. That's when it becomes an abusive relationship. And obviously I'm using an exaggerated like word form, like, oh, I'm not getting abused, but the relationship is being polluted in terms of the balance of it. Because as a coach, if I show up and I say, here's your end of it, this is what's wrong, you need to fix it, and then you waste your time scheduling another lesson with me where you haven't integrated the thing that I told you to go work on, well, now you can see how our relationship is becoming redundant and unfair, I would say. Because I can't do anything more than show you what you need to work on. At the point at which I do that, you have to be the one responsible for integrating those leaks and either coming back and saying, these are the angles of it I still don't understand, or coming back and having fixed it. But there's no room for us to show up to a new lesson and have you say, oh yeah, I just like forgot that like we were supposed to integrate that concept. Because that just shows a lack of work ethic, and that's not something I'm interested in. It's not a relationship I'm interested in pursuing when there's such a lack of motivation on the player's half to do his end of the work. In other words, the relationship just begins to lack potential immediately. And it's something I carry over into my personal life, probably with a little bit too much intensity, is in a lot of ways I expect things from people. I expect people to care more about their own self-betterment, and I don't think that's like a negative quality, but it boggles my mind on the day-to-day how rarely I see someone who's really committed to bettering their situation. Even when the patterns are very apparent to me that that process or that schedule or that life pattern that that person is not scaling towards anything, and then there's an awareness, they even have an awareness over that, but they're not willing to make adjustments to that pattern. For some reason that just like bothers me. I almost feel the pain of their stagnation because I remember very well and I'm connected to my own process having gone through that. But there's also a deep empathy for that because I remember how long it took me to actually spot the pattern and gain enough emotional leverage in terms of suffering through it to be like, okay, I have to change. What bothers me sometimes is that I know that if the person just trusted me, that I could see their pattern, that it was futile, that they would change, but I don't have that type of influence over many people. And in fact, you can't get that type of influence in a lot of ways. Like unless someone is like lobotomized by you, like unless you're their guru and they live on like a farm with you and they're like almost like in cult territory with you, you'll never be able to tell someone, yo, the pattern that you're engaging in is really unhealthy and I think you should change because they're doing it for a reason. They're rationalizing it for a reason. They already believe the credibility of their own assumptions that what they're doing is more beneficial than the alternative. So in a way, it's not about convincing people, even though I feel like if people were less assumptive of how healthy their patterns were, they could probably find improvements more quickly. What I'm saying is it is frustrating to believe that you are able to see from an unbiased perspective when looking more at someone's life than they can, and to watch them suffer through their own assumptions that the things that they're doing for themselves are actually healthy. For some reason that like bothers me. Not in a way where I'll be like angry toward that person, but just in a way where it's very unattractive to me to be around that type of energy because I don't see potential. And I'm sure that someone could do it with me. I would love actually, but this is the difference. I would love to have a fucking mentor who just like spied on me or did monthly check-ins with me where he analyzed my patterns and was like, here's the things I think you could optimize and change because it doesn't seem to be scaling. Just someone who spotted my blind spots for me and then was open and authentic enough to come to me and say, here's what I think you're doing wrong. Here's what I would recommend making, here's what I would suggest making adjustments with experimentally. The problem I see with a lot of people is you can't even approach them with an authentic level of conversation that's open to discussing this shit. Because as soon as you like enter the possibility that they could be handling their life in a way that's inaccurate or unhealthy, there's so many triggers that go off right there for most people. They don't want to hear it. Who are you to tell me? All that shit where like my perfect community would be one where we're able to speak so openly from such an understanding that all we have is love for each other and all we want is the best interest of the other person and the whole community, that nothing is taboo. And obviously we can be sensitive to each other's feelings, but there is no room in my future world for people who are not available to having open discussions about optimizing their experience, basically. One of the reasons that I snap called my roommate with Tim after a week after knowing him is because you can sense when someone has an energetic availability to that type of introspection, and a hunger for that type of self-improvement, and I love that. Sorry for the rant. I feel strongly about it. This hand's fine up until the river, where I think you force aggression. There's not a hot spot where this gets overfolded. That's something that we know from MDA over large samples. Once he check calls turn, his range is generally well protected. Also, specifically in this texture, he's going to have some 8x, which is snap calling you. He's also going to have more ace-x that check the turn when the 8 is a very good card for your range. So I just see this as being a very well protected spot for him. In a hotspot line that doesn't yield any sort of exploits to begin with. So then I would go further and say this texture is actually probably an anomaly where his range is much stronger than average across the aggregation. So I think this is forced aggression on the river. I would check back. Uh, Eric, unexceptional rounder, said in the chat, empathy doesn't require dishonesty. And I think that's such a huge point, is that most people think that they should really be careful what they say in certain spots because of they don't want to upset other people. Um, what I would say is, in a lot of ways, like, this is such a delicate balance. In a lot of ways, you're not being caring for the other person unless you're able to get over your own fear of being judged and stating it as you see it is, if you really believe it to be that way. If you really believe that you have an objective assessment that someone's doing something unhealthy for themselves, it is your duty from a caring place to bring that to their attention. Now, here's the catch. At a very high level of balance, and I can only really intuit this right now, but I believe it to be true, there is a level that you can get to where you can sense whether or not that person is energetically requesting that. And this is important because it stops you from banging your head against a wall with people who actually aren't capable of receiving that type of upgrade. In a lot of ways, what I see in culture is many people who have a lot of room for immediate self-growth, except they're not actually in any sort of state of availability to receive that intel. And at that point, I think someone who spots that, and even if you care about their development, you have to just sort of play it safe, and not even play it safe, but just from a place of maturity realize that they're not ready yet for that level of responsibility, or they're not approaching life at that level of maturity. And to bring that advice to them, you have to see the probability of it triggering them and probably sending them off into even more of a closed off direction. So it's a really delicate balance to play, and obviously it requires really good reads. Like, you have to be very sensitive to how energies and paradigms are functioning before you can look at someone and be like, I think this person's ready for this conversation so far. Obviously, I can't do that as well as I would like. Like, I'm in no way there in real life. Where I am there somewhat is when I'm in a poker lesson and I sense that the student, there's a doorway that opens into a deeper introspection. I just had one of these phone calls yesterday with Philippe from CFP. Something happens in the lesson where there's a doorway that opens, where there's the possibility for a deep introspection into a certain zone of the mental game. And if I sense energetically that the student is inspired to go in that direction, I will propose that we go there, and if he acknowledges it, then we'll go there. But I want some sort of signal from his energy body that he's ready to tap that. Because if there's not that, then I'm forcing that on him with my own insistence that he needs to make this upgrade now. And more often than not, I think that's heading into a volatile territory. Crushed it. Back to volatility. I think this ISO is good. Here, we have a volatile player profile. That needs to be established from the start. He's limping pre-flop. What I know about volatility profiles is I'm going to make way less folds on the river because they're capable of doing crazy shit. This guy triple barrels. We improved to a flush on the river. His betting range is fairly polarized. I'm not ready to make this fold versus a volatility profile, and it's almost that simple. I'll give better metrics for this if you have run it once elite, but this is where I'm leaving it for right now. Three bet, C bet. Brick card in the turn is going to lower his distribution of one pair plus hands. I think we need to be defending here. I just feel like it's too far up in our range to be folding consistently, and with this unique board texture, it's easier than not. Like, this is one of the more easy turns to give range constructions for him that would incentivize us to call. Obviously, like a 9 would be a way easier spot to fold. But I think that we're going to have enough domination on unpaired floats that this just needs to be called. Obviously, we have some showdown value, and obviously we have some overcard equity to improve if he does have a pair. Here's a spot where we're donking for no reason. This is just a line mistake. we're not at a big enough range advantage to even consider implementing a donking range here. I don't think it would exist in theory at all, so we just need to start by checking. And this is one of the sort of concerns I have about players who are not already very consistent in their range versus range interaction, bluff catching decision trees on future streets, is that if they put money in out of position on early streets, the error often gets compounded to spewing on later streets, where I think this river would probably be a clear fold on this run out, and we're still check calling in. Yeah, sorry. Question in the chat about how to combat post-flop passivity, or how can someone contact me directly if possible. Nick at pokerdetox.com. How to combat post-flop passivity: stab around in spots where there hasn't been previous aggression used post-flop. That's my simplest advice. A lot of stabbing hotspots exist. All right, I'm going to rip through these next 10 because I got to be out of here at 10 after 2 today. I guess we have 20 minutes. This hand I marked as, like, I want you to feel into this first. I know I do this a lot lately where I'm like, feel into the hand, but like, feel the awkwardness of this line. Awkward because we just folded away a lot of equity. In order to fold away that much equity, we have to have a high degree of confidence in our assumption that the villain is really, really pair heavy plus here. Any amount of domination that we have from unpaired hands, or any amount of fold equity that we could produce from check ripping, you know, if he was going to be ready to bet fold pocket sixes or something like that, the more I think we have to stay in with this hand and play a check raise on, which I think would be my line of choice here. I think we have too much equity to fold away and not enough confidence that the villain's range is so tight that we don't have a plus EV check raise at the point at which he bets. Okay. One of the reasons I marked this hand also was to give you an alternate flop line that could potentially prevent this awkwardness. We could do something here with this exact hand exploitatively, or with our flush draws exploitatively. Due to the larger pot size, we could do something like bet 12 on the flop and then like pot the turn. And then it would be like a more orthodox sizing scheme. And it would take away some of the turn awkwardness that you might be feeling with the stacked pot ratio. So that I think is a viable option too. What was the question from Rounder from that other hand? Looks like you guys resolved it. Here's a front door c-bet, which I think is okay. Now, this is where I need you guys to understand how important it is to have volatility notes on players. I don't know what notes you had on this guy, but my note, for the most part, is that he's playing short stacked. Sometimes on Bovada, that could just mean that he's a reg who forgot to reload, you know, last hand or something. But at the point at which you have any sort of confidence in volatility for this player, you need to approach this hand with way less confidence that you can be folding top pair good kicker on many turn or river combinations. So this guy's raising here. I think it's a fold all day in a vacuum, but with a volatility read, I think that shifts things quite a bit, and it matters a lot. So for those of you guys who are looking for ways to increase call efficiency and win rate in general, especially if you're on a site like Ignition, which has a high proportion of volatile players relative to other sites, start taking way better notes. Start looking at every hand, regardless of whether or not you're in it, and look for any tendency that could denote a fish. Is he short stacking? Is he limping pre-flop? Is he a guy who's donk betting out of position? Is he using sizing schemes that aren't theoretically advised? Is he seemingly unaware of ideas like geometric growth of pot? Like, is he jamming in spots where he should be utilizing multi-street betting? a lot of different shit that you can pay attention to that can give you increased confidence that you're dealing with a volatility profile so that they don't get away with shit like this versus you. If you have the volatility profile, you can sleep at night knowing that you're putting money in way lighter, and wait till you start lighting these fish up by calling them more aggressively in these spots. It's the best feeling in the world because you know that you're doing it from an intelligent metric, and it also just feels way better when you stop getting run over by players who are actually doing reckless shit against you. It's one of the bigger shifts. It's one of the bigger shifts I think in a player's game in terms of confidence boost is when his call efficiency versus the fish profiles really goes up, and he starts netting that all that extra profit versus them. I think it's something that makes his win rate and his confidence and his overall momentum of his journey really take off. Yeah, of course it matters that it's a multi-way pot here. If this is the one that you're, or are you talking about last hand too? Okay, you're talking about this hand. Yeah, of course. And this is what I'm saying. Like, if you're gonna look at this in the overarching blend of how often is this bluffed, you're right. That's why I'm saying it's a fold in a vacuum. But the the volatility of the volatility profile is so severe. The imbalances of the volatility profile is so severe that if a player can be categorized into that sub-profile with any sort of confidence, it's already becoming much more unlikely that we can justify bet folding in this spot. And that's what I'm saying is that on one hand, okay, I'm going to briefly go over this as how it emerged in the night vision thread. There was a time recently where we were looking at how to go deeper into bluff catching efficiency profiling. And one thing that was introduced was let's do a mass database of everyone without separating aliases and see what the imbalances are. But my intuition told me that there is already very good indicators that the guys who are bluffing too much are the volatile fish. I don't need 100 million hands of analysis to trust that. I have good enough intuition of a blatant imbalance that I can go off in that direction first. And that allows me to say, hey, let's refine the study. And instead, why wouldn't we start with the fish profile first and deconstruct the fish profile if we're going to do a mass data construction around that, a mass data model or whatever. And now we have something that's intuitively guided in a direction that seems to be more relevant and already more practical and precise. Now what that gives us is a metric. Okay, so we're calling more aggressively versus the volatility profile. Seems to make sense from everything we know about Bayesian probability and general psychology in general. The VPIP is a huge factor here. The fact that fish are playing way more hands pre-flop is going to give them opportunities to pull triggers way more post-flop in ways that they might not suspect that they're blowing their frequencies out of the water. In other words, I use that banana peel metaphor. It's easier to slip on a banana peel on a racetrack that has 100 banana peels on it as opposed to 10. That's what you're looking at in terms of the Bayesian tendencies of a fish to show up post-flop with more potential bluff triggers that he can pull. So that's the main thing. So yes, what you said is correct. Doesn't this matter that it's a multi-way pot? I've gone through my database, and in multi-way pots, guys who raised the turn big just had the nuts or very well equity randomized draws. True, but have you profiled what happens when you isolate the volatility profile? Because that's a whole different ballgame, and that's why I'm saying we can move to higher relevance in how we assess these spots if we stop focusing so contracted on it like, oh, this is a blind vacuum spot. If we have a volatility read here, we can dramatically increase our call efficiency. I love that comment by Arctic Munchies. Thanks for that. Really well said. Yeah, there might be a certain type of fish I would fold to. I mentioned this at the beginning of the lesson where it's like if it's the guy who's playing 43 or 45, like you said, 40 VPIP, 5 PFR, and then I also have low post-flop aggression stats for him, sure, that's an anomaly type of fish who you can assume is not prone to this type of tendency. Delay C bet, and now this is just a functionality issue. Our hand's not polarized enough to bet. It's still got some showdown value, and I don't think there's any real reason to believe that he's like overfolding one pair of hands to you here, so this just seems like a better check back. You definitely have a non-zero amount of showdown EV here. I don't know if you realize that. Generally, as a simple rule of thumb, you need a good reason to turn a hand with substantial showdown EV to tap back in position. You need a good reason to turn that into a bluff. This line in general indicates volatility. We know this from clairvoyant ignition research. It's prevalent enough that we think with high confidence that it applies to all other pools in general, because it's also not a line that's thoroughly incentivized by theory at a high frequency either, which already makes it strange. And when something's strange and unorthodox, it usually means it's coming from a player who's less thinking and, well, less of a thinking player or less of a sound player, and usually that trends more towards a spazzy or bad player. Um, so there's some degree of assumption in that trend of analysis, but for the most part, I would definitely advocate not overfolding in these spots. And if you check out how much you have to defend versus this raise, if you set it up in a model, you'll see this hand is like probably well above the 50th percentile of your flatting range. Sorry, of your c-betting range. I would say this is in like the 70th percentile of your c-betting range, which means it definitely needs to get defended versus a raise. Bugs? Call and assess. That's what you do there. This is probably just a fold pre-flop. Pretty ambitious to be calling this 3-bet in an environment that doesn't 3-bet enough to begin with, especially in the most dramatic nit 3-bet formation, UTG versus MP. Now you're donking again similar to the ace-x hand where you have no business donking at a significant range advantage, at a significant range disadvantage. This is the type of thing that happens. A player would probably try to justify this exploitatively, where he's like, well, if I get raised, I'll just fold. Problem is, you're introducing a degree of volatility that you don't have a high enough confidence in. For instance, you need a lights out read on what this guy rips before you can argue that you should bet fold here. And by donking, fucking bugs, you're introducing a level of volatility into his strategy that you don't really have enough confidence to say that you should be bet folding. So look what happens here. This is what I mean. We got bugs in the crib. They're everywhere. I don't know what's going on. All at once. I'm streaming. I can't talk right now. When you introduce a level of volatility that you don't have a high enough confidence in the jamming range, it's a poor exploit, meaning that you're premeditating this bet under the assumption that I know what he's going to do if he jams, so I can fold with really high confidence that he's not taking EV away from me. Yet apparently he's interpreting your jam as weak. So he's jamming you off of a better hand, and now you've introduced volatility without good reason. In order to make an exploitative fold, or an exploitative bet, especially in a spot where you are at a range disadvantage, you better have a really good understanding of what your opponent's responding with in terms of range construction in order for you to do it. This could be cool if you said, like, okay, let's construct a range analysis that would justify this. I think my opponent has a high distribution of overcards, and I don't think he'll ever turn those into a bluff. Therefore, I can retain a lot of equity by just bet folding, knowing he's never exploiting me, and I also get the value of denying equity realization from just blocker betting here. That would be cool, but realize the level of confidence that that assumption is predicated on. And then I brought this up in a lesson previously today where I said I'm not ready to present that argument in court, basically. I think they're fruit flies. Fucking Tim. Tim, if you're watching this post-mortem, this is because your mommy took care of you for 21 years and never made you clean up. Okay. What happened to the hand replayer window? Maybe you guys didn't see what that player had. So I can flash it again. Okay, now it's in view. That guy showed ace king. Thanks for that, guys. Bottom of my call 3-bet range in this spot would have been like pocket jacks, but I'd almost rather just play like a 4-bet fold range there. Here's another volatility line. These raise versus 3-bet lines that are not very orthodox are often merge bet. I actually think it's a decent exploit for him to merge raise here, because not enough guys rip over the top naked, so you can get pretty good definition. So this is a spot, it's funny this comes up after last hand, because this is a spot I actually think you can, with high confidence, as out of position, be check raising with like pocket eights and make pretty solid assumptions about what the villain will re-raise all in with. Not many guys will rip naked overs against you here. So you can raise for good definition and good equity realization denial and then fold to the re-raise, having a lot of functionality in that line. Now, if that's true, that a reg would do this for definition, and also a volatile profile is just doing it because he either doesn't understand polarity concepts or is blowing up, we can see how this is a pretty hard spot to justify a fold. So what we have to do here for the most part is call and assess. We can fold really bad turns where like spades hit and maybe like spade plus overcard hits, where we think that he's just not going to be barreling off naked enough. But for the most part, we have to respect the merge component of his range and just come to the conclusion there's not enough confidence in my assessment of his range being so tight at this moment that I could argue for a fold. Can't jam the tens for the most part because there's not enough functionality in the risk to reward of getting called. Under the assumption that we just said, if we knew he was so merged and would stack off, jamming is probably best. If he's going to raise fold hands like pocket eights, jamming becomes worse if we only run into a range that is dominating us severely when we get all in. And now there's other parts like what if he's just raising off, what if he's just really wild and he's raising ace-8 with an ace of spades and he's going to blast blank turns. Now we would love to keep that bluff in because it's poorly randomized enough that it's going to make big mistakes very frequently on turns unimproved. So there's really a very specific profile that you would need to argue for ripping for value, and it's the guy who's already merge raising and going to give you more value by stacking off. Otherwise the hand just has more functionality to play as a bluff catcher because based on the parameters that we're setting up, unless he's stacking off very merged, there's not enough polarization in pocket tens to argue for repolarizing. If you're check raising that flop with 8-8, what implication does that have on your check calling range? It likely means it's too capped, but my follow-up question would be, what implication does that have on the focus of how you look at the game? Because that already is a very contracted theoretical tunnel. So be very, very, very careful how much credibility you assign to that type of over-analytical reasoning, which seems very intelligent, but actually severely lacks relevance, especially in environments where villains don't have tons of information on you. So by all means, if you think you're playing in an environment that's well balanced and able to calibrate to detected imbalances very quickly, go do that. Make sure that check calling range is protected at a higher rate and engage in those thought processes of strategy development in that way, but realize that you are projecting a lot onto the capability of the fields if you think that they're focused on that, or if you think that they care about you enough to even get that read on you, or if you think that the sample is anywhere near large enough for them to have that read on you, all this type of stuff. So thanks for that question. I think it brings up a really good point of where the focus should be with strategy development, and hopefully that can be something that you reintroduce in your game when you're already crushing 5-10 or 10-20 on very prominent sites. But I don't think it's ever going to get there, honestly. That's not something I would even take into account. Well, it's not something you ever need to take into account on Ignition because it's an anon pool. If you're playing in a pool where you're playing with the same regs on a daily basis at high stakes and you think they're really good, that's the type of thing that's subtle enough in its construction or its strategy development incentivization that like I would look like if that became relevant, I would already be looking to change environments because I don't think that overall the environments are playing well balanced enough to incentivize me to stay in a pool at high stakes where I think I need to focus on uncapping my calling range there versus a series of regs where most of them are good enough to exploit it. If it's one regular limit, no big deal. If the pool is still inundated with fish, stay there. But at the point at which that becomes an overarching focus of your strategy development and general system, that you have to make sure that you're not capped in certain spots because players will maximally exploit that after even a short sample. Like, you're not playing nemesis opponents, not even close. So my theme of that is take the strategy that's most incentivized by the pool imbalance and focus less on how people would exploit you if they knew this was part of your imbalance. That's more or less paranoid, and it's the main thing that's keeping guys from deploying with more exploitative, profitable strategies. It's keeping them staying in more of a theoretical, over-analytical approach that's not maximizing, basically. 3-bet. This is a spot where, like, if you're ever going to blast a river, blast this one. Ace-Jack, Ace-10 will fold. Low pocket pairs will fold at a really high rate. Realize the range versus range interaction and seize these spots where it's also going to get a decent amount of credibility from your range, too, because that king's very good for you. Here's a spot I marked to show that this is a correct fold, even versus a volatility raise, basically because much more of his raising range will be equity driven. The monotone board and the fact that you don't have a heart makes a big difference here. So I just marked this hand to draw some sort of comparisons so that you can strengthen your recognition from different angles of exceptions to this type of rule. I like doing that sometimes in storms. Another volatility spot where his bet sizing is already making me a little bit sort of curious as to how much he understands about the game, period. The fact that this is an unorthodox sizing scheme by a long shot is making me feel like I should already be attributing some sort of volatility profile to it. That being said, I don't know if I'd make this call if I hadn't seen some shit going on in his strategy earlier, but this could be as simple as look at his VPIP via PFR. If he's wild, I'm already considering calling off here. And if I have any note whatsoever that he's more aggro in other spots where I've seen him either donk or bluff a river, I think we need to be snap calling this spot because people are doing shit like this when they're volatile. This is what I mean. Like, the bluff catching efficiency is all the win rate you'll ever need to turn yourself from like a 3 BB winner to a 10 BB winner in these types of games. And then focus on the other shit. Then focus on whether or not people know that you're capped in certain spots. Let's maximize in the departments that we need to maximize in first. That's a huge part of my program right now, is like getting guys on board with the fact that there are actually zones that are more worth your focus if you've clarified for yourself that win rate is what you care about. And for those guys that are like, well, no, I still actually want to like make sure that I'm really good at theory so I can apply it, go fuck yourself. Because you're just lying to yourself, and you're doing that to confirm an over-analytical paradigm that you're too afraid to surrender. Just because we're taking more exploitative strategies, guys, doesn't mean we don't understand equilibrium. Like, that's a huge point that I tried to make in my last Run It Once video. There is a difference between understanding theory and understanding equilibrium. And equilibrium is where it's at, because that's what's going to allow you to calibrate in the future, is having a sense of where the equilibrium is and then knowing the proper exploits around it. You don't know theory just because you study grids or you know toy game theory. You know theory when you understand equilibrium. I think that's the point I made in the Run It Once vid. Is bluff catching efficiency very important? Well, yes, considering that the spots where there are the most imbalances in the pool are the spots where there's the most win rate available, and I would say bluff catching is the spots where there's the greatest imbalances in the pool because there's guys like this that are doing those types of things. Don't barrel without equity versus fish. That's simple. He's limping. You're blasting with 2 overs in a spot where he's just going to give you too much resistance, so it's not part of my blueprint strategy versus fish. Sorry, Brian. That's funny, though. It really wasn't that heated. It was just a moment. Here's an exception to that rule where now you do pick up equity. You've got gutter and over versus fish. So this is cool pattern recognition to show exceptions. So now by all means barrel this card because it's more of a scare card to the lower pairs in his range. You'll probably get more fold equity, and you also have the gutter, which is more robust. Now you need to pull this trigger, even versus a fish. It's just a really hard card for him to connect with based on what his range looks like, and I think you're going to get a decent level of honesty out of a fish on this runoff. Okay, guys, that's it. Wish I could hang out and chill, but I've got to run. I've got to go to some appointments. I'm headed on vacation from the 11th through the 15th. I'll be going to LA for a few days, and then I'll be coming back and doing another storm on the 19th, volunteer style. Couple more Facebook slash Instagram live Q&A slash giveaways. I'll post that on the schedule here. Keep an eye on the blog because I'm getting more active. I'm gonna go back to old school Nick for a little while and do some more philosophical type stuff and mental game stuff and just like stuff like I did today, which is like pose a question that I think the community doesn't have a really good understanding of and just open it up to you guys to sort of battle it out, trying to give your reasonings behind it. I like engaging like that. I think it's cool. Thanks for showing up. Hope you got something out of it. If you enjoy volatility and want to learn more about it, check out future Run It Once videos. I'll be doing a whole video on that there. Same thing with integration too. Going to be doing a whole video on the art of subconscious integration. Thanks guys. See ya.